Now that we've discussed the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, we're going to get into some of the more distant endocrine glands. And all of these remaining endocrine organs are going to receive hormones from the anterior or the posterior pituitary glands. So next up on our list is the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland can be found at the base of the neck and will often have two lobes, a left lobe and a right lobe. However, there is sometimes a third lobe known as the pyramidal lobe, and you can see that shown on this picture here. And this little region that connects the two lobes is known as the isthmus. The isthmus. I always struggle to pronounce that word, the isthmus. That is a tough one for me, and I will not be asking you to pronounce that throughout this class, but you do have to at least know how it's spelled so that you can identify it. But that region right here in the center is going to connect the left and the right lobes of the thyroid gland. Now, the thyroid gland is one of my favorites, and that is partially because of the way this thyroid gland looks. So it's often described as a butterfly-shaped gland. But if you ask me, I really like to see this with the pyramidal lobe, because to me, it sort of looks like Batman's symbol just a little bit. I was never huge on Batman, but that's sort of what it looks like to me. So you can see another picture of the thyroid gland representing that there. Now we're going to see in just a minute that on the back of the thyroid gland, we can actually find the parathyroid glands, and we'll go over those as soon as we're finished with the thyroid gland. But what we'll find with the thyroid gland is that there are two major hormones that it's going to release. And I'll get into those in just a second. But I first want to real quickly explain the microscopic structure of the thyroid gland. So within the thyroid gland, the tissue that makes up the thyroid gland, if we zoom in very, very, very far, we'll see that there are little follicles that are in the thyroid gland. Little follicles make up the thyroid gland, and you can sort of see that shown here. There's these little circles here, these cellular arrangements, and then this space in the center. And so this circular structure is what's known as a follicle. And each follicle contains this central portion, and that pinkish stuff in the central portion is known as colloid. And colloid is just a fancy name for stored thyroid hormone. So that's actually where our stores of thyroid hormone is found on the insides of these follicles. You'll see on the outsides we have the follicular cells. These are the follicular cells that make up the follicle. Those are going to be the cells that are in charge of releasing thyroid hormone. And we'll also have parafollicular cells. The parafollicular cells are not found in the parathyroid gland, so do not mix that up. The parafollicular cells are found in the thyroid gland because para means to the side. So these parafollicular cells are to the side of the thyroid follicle. So you can see those shown in this picture. But on this slide, we'll see that there's going to be two major types of cells, the follicular cells and the parafollicular cells. And each one is going to release a different hormone. And these are the two that come from the thyroid gland. So first and foremost are the follicular cells. And those are going to release our thyroid hormone, which are given the names tetraiodothyronine and triiodothyronine. So we can also call those T4 and T3. So tri for T3 and tetra for T4. Triiodo stands for 3 iodine groups. And that is, in fact, what makes up thyroid hormones. There's going to be iodine groups, and these can be found attached to other amino acids. Tetraiodothyronine, tetra means 4, so this molecule is going to have 4 iodine-containing groups. Thyroxine is another name for tetraiodothyronine, so you're welcome to use each of those names, but I suggest that you know both of them, because I'll often use this one. I like this name better because it tells you how many iodine groups are found on it. So those two, T3 and T4, are known as our thyroid hormones. And again, in response to thyroid-stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, our follicular cells are going to release those thyroid hormones. Now the parafollicular cells, which I did mention on the last slide, and I told you about the parafollicular cells, that these are not found in the parathyroid gland, they are found in the thyroid gland. Those are also known as the C cells, and in fact that's what I prefer to call these cells, or the C cells. They are C cells because they produce a hormone known as calcitonin. So that's a nice little way to remember what the parafollicular cells release, is calcitonin. Now, I would hope that we all remember calcitonin, at least slightly, from Anatomy and Physiology 1. But we will find calcitonin as playing a major role in our body's calcium homeostasis. So we would have learned about this in Chapter 6 in A&P 1. Calcitonin is going to lower blood calcium. And parathyroid hormone is going to higher blood calcium. So the calcitonin and parathyroid hormone we're going to see play a major role in our body's calcium homeostasis. Again, these were two hormones that were mentioned in A&P 1 with a negative feedback loop system. So PTH here stands for parathyroid hormone. Calcitonin and parathyroid hormone are antagonists, and they're going to stimulate osteoblasts and osteoclasts respectively to make sure that our blood calcium remains in the very, very narrow range in which it's allowed. Now, I will talk a little bit more about calcitonin in a few slides, but the next immediate slides are specifically going to mention thyroid hormone. So this slide is going to go over an 8-step process where we will talk about how T3 and T4 are synthesized. As if we do not already have plenty of mechanisms to go over, you'll be pleased to know that I am just joking. You do not need to know what is on this slide. I will not be testing you on this 8-step process. But what I will be testing you upon are the actions of thyroid hormones. And you can see that there are quite a few actions, so we're going to take a second to go over each of these. So thyroid hormone is commonly known as our body's major metabolic hormone. This is going to be the hormone that controls our body's entire rate of metabolism. So we will see that more thyroid hormone will increase our body's basal metabolic rate. And with this comes things such as protein synthesis and increased body temperature. We'll see that we're going to increase glucose use and fatty acids to make more and more ATP. ATP is, of course, our byproduct of metabolism. So naturally, if we have more thyroid hormone release, that's going to increase the amount of ATP that's being produced. We'll see that thyroid hormone will help to regulate growth and development, and it's going to do so with a few other hormones, human growth hormone and insulin, which we'll discuss when we get to the pancreas. But being our body's major metabolic hormone, it's important to understand that metabolism and growth are directly related to each other. So that is another function of thyroid hormone. The other function that we have here is the upregulation of the beta receptors that will attach to our catecholamines. Now that is a really, really big statement, so let me elaborate on this one just a little bit. We'll have to think back to Chapter 15 in A&P 1, which was the autonomic nervous system, when we discussed the beta receptors. Beta receptors are a type of adrenergic receptor. We have beta 1 and we have beta 2. Catecholamines are molecules such as norepinephrine and epinephrine. And norepinephrine is the one that we're going to really be focusing on here with the beta receptors. Since this was an adrenergic receptor, it's going to receive norepinephrine. So the upregulation of these receptors causes more action from norepinephrine whenever norepinephrine makes its way to its target cell. So another very, very important function of thyroid hormone. So on this slide, we'll see the negative feedback regulation of thyroid hormone release. Now, we're going to go over this, but I want you to be aware that this negative feedback loop is very, very similar to the other negative feedback loops that we have seen. So we'll go ahead and start up with the hypothalamus, where we will release thyrotropin-releasing hormone. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is going to travel through the hypophyseal portal system, through the infundibulum, to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release thyroid-stimulating hormone. And this is going to be from our thyrotrophs. And so thyroid-stimulating hormone is going to be released into the blood. It's going to circulate throughout the vasculature and eventually make its way down to the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland, in response to that, will then release T3 and T4, which are our two thyroid hormones. Now, when the concentration in the blood of T3 and T4 is too much or it gets too high, that's going to feed back and prevent the further release of thyrotropin-releasing hormone, as well as thyrotropin or thyroid-stimulating hormone. So this is actually a humoral signal. This is a humoral signal for secretion. You can see that the low blood levels of thyroid hormone are initially what stimulated the release of thyrotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. You'll see increased levels of thyroid hormone will also prevent thyroid stimulating hormone from its further release. So the same type of negative feedback loop that we've been seeing, most of our endocrine organs are going to be regulated in this way by negative feedback. So on the next two slides, we're going to see the actions of the thyroid hormones as well as the action of calcitonin. So you can see that negative feedback loop that's really discussed right here. Thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is going to come and stimulate the release of thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, and that all occurs in response to low thyroid hormone levels in the blood. And that's going to stimulate thyroid hormone's release. And then we're going to see that these actions will take place once thyroid hormone is released from the thyroid gland. So you can see it's going to increase the basal metabolic rate. It's going to stimulate the synthesis of proteins. And you'll see from this slide that many of these actions were discussed over here. So these are the actions of thyroid hormones that I'd like you to be aware of. So we've got protein synthesis taking place. We're going to be making more proteins. We're going to be increasing lipolysis. So we're going to be breaking down lipids so that we can use those for energy. And thyroid hormone is also going to be important for speeding up our body's growth and also helping with development of the nervous system as well as our bones. Just keep in mind that the follicular cells that are found around the thyroid follicle are going to be the cells that are releasing the thyroid hormone. This colloid in the center is our stored thyroid hormone. And so these follicular cells that have access to the colloid are able to release that into the bloodstream. Now, calcitonin, on the other hand, is coming from our parafollicular cells. And you can see the parafollicular cells are to the sides of the follicular cells. So these, again, you can see are going to be releasing calcitonin. They also have a humoral signal that will control their release. Increased levels of blood calcium is going to cause the release of calcitonin. And we're going to release calcitonin so that we can lower our blood levels of calcium. You can see we do this by inhibiting our osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are the cells that are going to crush bone. They're going to break it down and release it into the bloodstream. So we're going to stop the process of bone resorption by osteoclasts, and instead we're going to have other signals that activate osteoblasts. And our osteoblasts are going to build bone. They're going to be in charge of the process of bone deposition. So this is going to force calcium into our bone's extracellular matrix. Now we'll see the other side of calcium homeostasis when we get to the parathyroid gland, but first we have to discuss the disorders that are associated with the thyroid gland. So we have a few conditions that are of interest to us. First off is a goiter, we have Graves' disease, and we have hypothyroidism. Now Graves' disease is just one type of hypersecretion of thyroid hormone. That's going to be too much release in thyroid hormone. Graves' disease is actually an autoimmune disorder that produces antibodies that will eventually mimic the action of thyroid-stimulating hormone, and this in turn produces too much release of thyroid hormone. One of the symptoms that we see that's associated with Graves' disease is shown over here, which is exophthalmos. Exophthalmos refers to the bulging of the eyes, and you can see that shown here. Now, even though this is not typed up on the slides, I would like you to be aware of exophthalmos. I've written it on the slides in red so that you can see that and make sure that you know that. So Graves' disease is what we get if we have too much thyroid hormone secretion. Now we also have a few types of hypothyroidism, so you can sort of look at Graves' disease and hypothyroidism and all of these as opposites from each other. So hypothyroidism is when we do not release enough thyroid hormone. Cretinism is a form of hypothyroidism that starts in children. It's congenital, which means that it's genetic. This can often lead to mental retardation. And if we have this in one of our patients, essentially we start giving them oral thyroid hormone immediately, and they will continue that treatment for the extent of their life. Myxedema, on the other hand, is a type of advanced hypothyroidism. Myxedema manifests with symptoms such as a low heart rate, low blood pressure, sensitivity to the cold, and general lethargy. You can look at it as though we don't have enough thyroid hormone, so our metabolism is not working as quickly as it should, and we're therefore not going to have as much ATP production as we normally are supposed to have. Hashimoto's disease, on the other hand, is an autoimmune form of hypothyroidism, where our own immune system attacks the thyroid gland. It views the thyroid gland as a foreign tissue, and so therefore we start attacking the thyroid gland, and that will, in response, release less thyroid hormone. So all of these, while different, are all considered types of hypothyroidism, where we do not have enough release of thyroid hormone. Now lastly here for our thyroid disorders is the goiter. The goiter essentially is shown here. We get this very, very enlarged thyroid gland, and essentially what causes the thyroid gland to enlarge is a lack of iodine. Iodine, as I mentioned before, is very, very important in the structure of thyroid hormone. And if we don't have enough iodine in the diet, we're not going to be able to make enough thyroid hormone. So incomplete thyroid hormone just starts to build up inside of the thyroid gland, and that's what enlarges it. This is often common in countries where iodine is not very common. And so therefore, we don't see this very, very often in the United States. But one of the reasons why our numbers are here low in the United States is because we have what is known as iodized salt. We basically take iodine and attach it to salt. So anytime we eat salt, that's going to bring iodine into the diet. And I'm sure that you are all aware that America has no shortage of salty foods. Our next major endocrine organ that we're going to discuss are the parathyroid glands. Now these are found on the back side of the thyroid gland. We'll have two on each side. You can see these depicted right here. We have a right superior parathyroid gland and we have a right inferior parathyroid gland. And we'll have the same arrangement here on the left side. Since the parathyroid glands are found on the thyroid gland, it's very helpful to have a picture such as this to show us the boundary of the thyroid gland here and the boundary of the parathyroid glands here. Now there are two major cells that can be found in the parathyroid gland. There are the chief cells and the oxyphil cells. And we can see the chief cells shown here in purple. So they're going to be the smaller ones, chief cells. And we have the oxyphil cells, and these are going to be a little bit larger. Now, our chief cells are going to be the major player with the parathyroid gland because these are the cells that are going to release parathyroid hormone. And as I just briefly mentioned, parathyroid hormone is going to antagonize calcitonin. So that tells us that parathyroid hormone is extremely important for calcium homeostasis. The oxyphil cells, on the other hand, we're really still not sure exactly what these cells do. But they can be useful when looking for the parathyroid gland because these cells will stain a lot differently than the cells that are found in the thyroid gland. So these can be useful in that regard. So we've got two major types of cells in the parathyroid gland, but one major hormone that's going to come out of it. So the chief cells are releasing the parathyroid hormone, which is directly going to antagonize calcitonin from the thyroid gland. So this slide will nicely show us the homeostatic interplay of these two hormones in the bloodstream together. So we'll start here with number one. When we have too much calcium in the blood, that's eventually going to go stimulate the parafollicular cells in the thyroid gland to release calcitonin. And once calcitonin is released into the bloodstream, it will circulate, and it's going to block the activity of osteoclasts. Osteoclasts break down bone and release those minerals into the bloodstream, so calcitonin is going to prevent this. Osteoclasts break down bone and release those minerals into the bloodstream. So if we inhibit osteoclasts, we're not going to be releasing calcium into the bloodstream any longer, and therefore that decreases calcium blood levels. Now, in the event that our blood calcium gets too low, that's where we're going to start seeing parathyroid hormone coming in and taking action. If for some reason we don't have enough calcium that can be found in our blood, the chief cells that can be found in the parathyroid gland will release parathyroid hormone. So in response to low calcium, the chief cells are going to release parathyroid hormone, and in response to high calcium, the parafollicular cells are going to release calcitonin. So as our calcium levels continue to drop, more parathyroid hormone is going to be released from the chief cells in the parathyroid gland. Parathyroid hormone is going to do the exact opposite as calcitonin. This is actually going to promote more release of calcium into the blood so that can maintain our blood levels of calcium. But that's not the only thing that the parathyroid hormone is going to do. It's actually going to go over to the kidneys and it's going to decrease calcium secretion into our renal tubules. Now I know we haven't done much on the kidneys, but calcium is going to be released in the urine. So basically the kidneys are going to make sure that they hold on to more calcium and don't release as much into the urine. And yet still, that is not all that parathyroid hormone is going to do. It's also going to tell the kidneys to start releasing a molecule known as calcitriol. Calcitriol is also known as the active form of vitamin D. So as was discussed in A&P1, vitamin D is going to be necessary for calcium absorption from the diet. So as we release more calcitriol, calcitriol is going to enhance the calcium absorption from the foods that we eat, and that is also in turn going to increase our blood levels of calcium. Now, these two arrows, as they make their way back up, if calcium gets too high, we're then going to release more calcitonin. If calcium then in turn gets low again, we're going to release more parathyroid hormone. So this is a really nice slide to follow this cascade of events as calcium's levels are constantly going up and down in the bloodstream. Again, there's a very, very narrow range that calcium can exist within the bloodstream. We have to make sure that our blood calcium levels are between 9 and 11 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood. This is a very, very closely regulated system, so calcitonin and parathyroid hormone are going to be the major players in making sure that all of those parameters are met. So the parathyroid gland is quite nice because we only have two types of cells we need to know and one hormone that's going to come from this gland. You'll see that low blood calcium is going to stimulate its release, and high blood calcium is going to prevent its release. Its main purpose is to increase blood calcium, which was just described on the last slide. It's going to do this by a couple ways. It's going to increase bone resorption by osteoclasts. It's going to increase calcium reabsorption by the kidneys. And it's also going to help the production of calcitriol. This active vitamin D is going to bind to calcium so that we can bring that into our body. For those of you that don't quite remember vitamin D, basically, vitamin D is necessary for us to absorb calcium. Calcium on its own cannot be absorbed into the body. We could eat pounds of calcium and it wouldn't get absorbed if we didn't have vitamin D. So our bodies can only absorb calcium when vitamin D is bound to it, and that's why we have to have more vitamin D being produced. So there are really three mechanisms that we see here. We have the increase in osteoclastic activity, we have the increase in calcium reabsorption, and we have the production of calcitriol, which will in turn increase the rate of calcium absorption. Now, to finish up the parathyroid gland, we have two conditions, hypoparathyroidism and hyperparathyroidism. Both of these are just as they sound. Hypoparathyroidism refers to too little parathyroid hormone, and hyperparathyroidism refers to too much parathyroid hormone. If we have hypoparathyroidism, we're going to end up with a deficiency of blood calcium, because parathyroid hormone won't be able to carry out its major action, which is to increase blood calcium. And if we have hyperparathyroidism, we're going to have elevated levels of parathyroid hormone in the blood, which will eventually lead to too much bone resorption, and that will cause our bones to become very soft and brittle.